Food, hospitality, dining, all of the above is the lens with which we see ourselves. It is the lens that, we can explore our history, our culture, our community.
Today on Dirty Linen, we are continuing our, could you call it an investigation, a series of musings, some wrangling in conversation around this question, is hospitality broken? I am really looking forward to today's chat with Ben Liebmann. Ben has an interesting perspective on the hospitality industry. You certainly couldn't call him an outsider because he was the COO of a little restaurant called Noma for 7 years until 2022. But he has so much else going on in his life that I think he has a really interesting, broad and different perspective on the hospitality industry. Ben, welcome to Dirty Linen.
Thanks, Dani. Great to be back. Great to be with you.
Yeah, so good to have you on the show. So, I've set it up a little bit, but put yourself in context. Where are you speaking from? And I don't mean from the car in the garage in the house. I mean, tell us your perspective on this topic.
Look, I guess it comes from, as you said, this kind of fortunate position of having had 7 extraordinary years within a small but acclaimed restaurant, but also, I guess, having come from the outside originally, so having spent prior to that point 15 or so years in media and entertainment, and since leaving Noma, trying to piece all of that together. Reflecting in my mind, at least anyway, how these worlds are increasingly intersecting. These creative cultures, these creative communities are coming together, whether that be food and hospitality, media, entertainment, music. I mean, for me, they're ultimately all passion points for the consumer, for the audience, for the diner. And I've tried, I guess, over my career to see the commonalities in that and also see the clear space between them and try to apply knowledge and learnings from one field, one category, one industry and bring them across to the other and vice versa. Is it broken? No, I don't think it is. Is it increasingly challenged? Absolutely. I think I was thinking about it in preparation for this, and I wonder whether everybody is. I wonder whether or not there are differing stages of pain. There are those who are feeling it, and then there are those who are really feeling it. And I think that's perhaps just a reflection of the time that we're in at the moment, whether that be structural changes within the industry and the industries that wrap around it, whether that be socioeconomic, whether that be macroeconomic. I think everybody is feeling it. It's just the different degrees with which they are right now.
Yeah, I think that's really, really well said, because I think also I feel like people are letting themselves feel it to some degree. Like there is that sort of breaking point or that inflection point where you can't deny that things are super tough.
I also wonder whether we're more comfortable post-pandemic talking about these things, which is a good thing, by the way, in terms of people are more willing to show their vulnerability. One of the things I thought coming back from, nearly 10 years abroad between London and then Copenhagen, and certainly this post-pandemic was, it felt that the industry had laid down its arms. And what I meant by that was, before leaving, I always had this sense that there was a certain tribalism within hospitality in this country. Yes, we were all part of this one extraordinary industry and this one extraordinary community, but there were tribes and there was at times pot shots thrown from one at the other. And I think coming out of the pandemic, there was this sense that actually we were all in this together. This industry is bloody hard, that perhaps we were holding ourselves and each other to too high a standard, and that there was, I guess, a willingness to acknowledge those on the other side and to think, whatever it takes to get up in the morning, whatever it takes to keep your business afloat, that's okay. And we won't necessarily throw pot shots at each other anymore, because the audience, the consumer, they don't. They love, by and large, they love what hospitality does. And I think we were often our own worst critics. And my sense coming back to Australia post-pandemic was everybody had kind of laid down their arms and were trying to support one another. And I think one of the ways to do that was this openness, this willingness to talk, to show vulnerability, to talk about how hard it is. And I hope that conversation, and you've been a huge part of facilitating that, allows us to talk not only about the challenges and the issues that the industry is facing, of course also celebrate the things that make it really special, but to start having the conversations about what it will take to reset the foundations or ensure this industry is sustainable and as vibrant in every sense in the future that we hope for.
Okay, I feel like there are three things in everything you've just said that I want to come back to, so I'm going to hope I can remember them. One of them is around this idea of pot shots and this, perhaps, is there something exceptional about hospitality, and do people love it as much as you think? Because on the one hand, I mean, I feel like every time there was some sort of pandemic, I don't know, change of rules or whatever, that happened every 5 minutes. But I think we always heard from hospitality, and I feel like there was an impatience among some parts of the general public, like, oh my God, why do we have to hear from another cafe owner every time there's a lockdown? Like, the whole of society is affected. So I think as much as there were people, people knew to support their local cafes and they were embedded in their neighbourhoods and all of that. But I think there was also this sense that hospitality whinges a lot. And, I've got an article that you're part of that's coming out this week in The Age and the SMH around this topic. And my editor asked me to put a paragraph at the top just sort of setting this up, like, we always seem to hear from hospitality how hard things is. There's never been an easy time for the industry. We heard about it when, fringe benefits tax came in, when the GST came in, during the GFC, and certainly during the pandemic. Should people just accept that this is a hard industry and just get on with it? So there's that. I'll just leave that there. The other thing that you mentioned about, you just do anything that you can to keep your business going. Yes, but the conversation that started this whole topic was our one with Alex Elliott-Howery from Cornersmith, and that resonated with so many people. And for her, it was that she just couldn't let herself do whatever it would take, which might mean, using inferior products or being less conscious of the environment. She couldn't let that go, and therefore be a little bit more profitable because it's cheaper to run a business that didn't align with her values. So I think a lot of people are struggling with that.
When I said do whatever it takes, I didn't actually mean cut corners, reduce quality. What I'm often thinking about is cast your mind back, 3-4 years ago? I'm losing track of when it was, but and these are sweeping statements. But if a chef or a restaurateur went into packaged goods, created a product, or if they partnered with a brand, or if they went into a hotel, we would have heard the term sellout. Not from the audience, not from the diner, not from the consumer, but in hushed tones from somebody else within the industry. And for me, that was always a flawed and horrible kind of approach that many in the industry took to their peers. That said, that's the exact same thing, Dani, I heard when I was working in the music industry 20 years ago. 20 years ago, if a musician or an artist or a band did something with a brand, they were a sellout. Now, nothing happens if those bands aren't partnering with a brand or doing something in product or doing something in media. And the industry has matured. The consumer was always fine with it. And I think that's for me has been the headline is as long as you do those things with the same, and I'm going to use a buzzword, authenticity and integrity that you would inside your cafe, inside your restaurant, inside your wine bar, do it. Do it. They're the things that the industry should be thinking about when I say that anything should be on the table. It's not cutting corners to use lesser quality products or have more of an outsized impact on the environment or, kind of taking advantage of the community. It's starting to think outside the box because the consumer never put us in a box. We were the ones who held ourselves to such a high standard and took pot shots at one another. And now I look at it and I think we look at chefs who are creating products and who are partnering with brands and who are going into hotels. And the ones who are doing it with great integrity and great authenticity, using that word again, are not only succeeding, they're being celebrated. And so just to clarify, that for me is what I mean when I think about what more can we doing? What more can we be doing? How do we see what we create inside a restaurant, inside a cafe, inside a wine bar as being one manifestation of our craft, of our creativity, rather than the only thing? In terms of, does the general public love hospitality? I do think they do. I think it's up to us to communicate that, something that you and I talked about when we spoke last week, is for an industry that has the impact, whether that be emotional, cultural, economic, given the size of hospitality. I don't think the industry has been very good in communicating itself to other stakeholders, whether that be consumer, government, industry. Certainly not when I compare it to other similar sized industries like media that I have been in the past. And for me, that's something that we need to think about. But I will say, and this is a somewhat, flippant remark, but hearing you say that there were people in the community who were kind of saying, enough, we know it's hard, or enough, get over it, is why is then hospitality the first industry that everybody turns to when there is a crisis? Why is it that hospitality and music, for that matter, it's chefs and musicians? Why is it that those industries are the first that everybody turns to when there's a bushfire, when there is some other type of crisis? And hospitality is expected, and it does it. It does it every time. Chefs come together for a cause, and they're never asking for something. And you can tell that it kind of really gets me annoyed, that kind of sense of, just kind of shut up and cook or get back in the kitchen. But really, that's for us to change, because I don't think if that does exist within the community, it's for us to kind of remind them. It's for us to kind of bring them with us to see hospitality is not only this wonderful industry, but that the people who serve them, the people that create for them, are more than just cooks and chefs and waiters and servers. They are change makers. They are part of the community. So yes. Sorry, I'll get off. I'll get off my soapbox. I might get back on, but I'll get it off it. I'll get it off it for now.
No, I want to jump on this. I'll jump on this soapbox with you any day. And this was the third topic, so you got there for me. I didn't even need to write it down. Why do you think it is so fraught? Why can't hospitality speak with one voice? Why isn't there this, industry body that everybody can get behind?
What is hospitality? ? That's a subject in itself. It is everything from fine dining through to the local hero. It is everything from the mom and pop shop through to the independent sole trader, through to the small to even larger restaurant groups. There is so many individual parties within this industry at various levels. And by level, I don't mean quality or standard. I just mean, where do you peg them within this ecosystem? That's what's made it increasingly difficult. I was talking with somebody about it last week, and they said, during the pandemic, it became apparent that the industry didn't have a voice or didn't have a meaningful voice because, and I say this with the utmost respect for everything that he has created, but because the industry kept turning to Justin. The sense was he was the only one that could have the impact with government, with industry. And that is amazing. That is a credit to everything that he has created. But we can't just rely on one individual or one organization to be our spokesperson. We need to create, or we need to elevate what we have. But, I'll say, we need to create that singular voice that is lobbying, whether in a literal term or in a more kind of philosophical sense, that is lobbying government, that is speaking to media, that is speaking to the community, that is, talking to the industry. Because you asked me last week, you said, what's the solution? And I said, there isn't one. There isn't one solution. Everything has to be on the table, including the way that government looks at hospitality, not only whether that be considerations around tax and rebates and offsets and reinvestment in the industry. But there needs to be a conversation with corporates, whether that be media or brands, around opportunities for them and for hospitality by coming together. With landlords, whether that be the smaller, but more likely the bigger end of town, the groups and the opportunities that hospitality can present to them. But I think a lot of those conversations will only have real impact if it's impossible to speak as one, then at least we're speaking as fewer but more aligned voices that speak for as many as possible.
Interesting. And so just for anyone who didn't pick that up, I'm assuming you're speaking about Justin Hems from Merivale, who was definitely, I think, a bigger voice in New South Wales than he was in Victoria.
Of course. And yes, you're absolutely right. You are talking with somebody based in Sydney. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's interesting. There were other, I guess, louder voices in Victoria, but I would agree with you that as much as any of those voices could speak loudly and certainly with some authority, they weren't representing everybody. I think, different to, let's say, I don't know, oil industries or entertainment. I mean, the hospitality industry is so disparate, as you point to, and people are so buried in their businesses that I think it's really hard for them to work on their own business rather than in them, let alone on the industry. So I just
But you and I talked last week, and that coincided with, I think, 6, maybe 7 of the most powerful media representatives of 6 or 7 of the most powerful media entities in this country, the free-to-air broadcasters, the public broadcasters, sitting in front of, I think it was the Senate, or a Senate estimates, or a kind of one of the bodies, lobbying to protect the industry from big tech and big media from overseas, to protect Australian media as an industry, as an employer, as a facilitator of stories and voices that are important to defining Australia. And I don't have the numbers in front of me, but hospitality as an overall industry is a contributor to the economy. And I believe it contributes far more than just economics, but sometimes there are certain people in the community that will only listen to numbers. Hospitality is not far off, if not close to, as equal a contributor to the Australian economy as Australian television. But why don't we as an industry have as powerful a voice? Why aren't we lobbying at that level successfully or meaningfully to achieve some of the change that we need to be made, or having the beginnings of conversations around the types of change that we need to be that we need to have made. And likewise, going back to that point you made earlier, communicating, again, I don't think we should have to, but if we do, communicating to the public about the importance of hospitality as a contributor to the community.
What do you think, like a small restaurant could do, going back to, some of these things you talked about with collaborations or branding opportunities, and I guess communicating to the people around them about their importance? Like, what is within the power of any neighbourhood restaurant to get on with at the moment?
I mean, this conversation, you and I have obviously known each other for a lot longer, but this was sparked by your story with Alex and about Cornersmith, and I think she has said they're at a very interesting inflection point. They knew they couldn't continue doing what they were doing in its current form, but you look at how they have tried to diversify, again, you use a term like that, in terms of moving into products, building that engagement with their community, their audience, their consumer beyond the times with which they step into that cafe, into that restaurant. I think that building that connection, I think many of the smaller operators, the cafes, the restaurants that are starting to kind of build that connection are doing through social media. Which, look, I think the thing I'm mindful of is all of this takes time, and all of this takes time away from doing what many of them feel most comfortable doing, which is creating and serving. And that's one of the fundamental challenges here, is that I think I said to you when we spoke, when I was working in television, two of my bosses at the time talked about one of the legacy television shows that we made, and said, the easiest thing to do would be to pull this show over, using a car reference, repair it, and then put it back on the road. But the reality is we have to do that while it's going down the freeway at 100 miles an hour. And I think that's the thing we're talking about here with hospitality, is it's not as if these businesses can close and right size or retool or start the process of diversification. They have to keep opening. Many of them have to keep doing that 7 days a week. But things like social media, where you are in control of that narrative, that communication channel with your audience, and you can build that relationship. And then, is that a business? No, but with that richer relationship beyond that transactional, what is often that transactional relationship of, stepping through the door to buy a cup of coffee and then leave again and not come back for 24 hours, you can start building that. I have a bakery down the street, started 7 days a week, moved to 5, and is now 4. Now, made that decision to preserve the mental health and well-being of the team. They just didn't feel that a business of that size could operate at, in inverted commas, scale 7 days a week, and asked themselves really difficult questions. Those heart-to-hearts of will we lose our consumer? Will they go somewhere else? They're the type of bakery that has lines down the street, and they've done it. They've done it successfully. They did it by being transparent. They talked about it with their consumers, with their customers. They used social media, but they also started using social media to announce new things that they were working on, doing masterclasses of an evening, selling products, even communicating the menu items that were coming. And that dialogue, that constant dialogue, has built a relationship between them and the community that they're a part of. And that's allowing them to start, as I say, diversifying from just selling extraordinary bread and pastries and coffee into other revenue lines that will hopefully give them not only a sustainable business, but a sustainable work-life balance.
Yeah, I think people certainly are more willing to have those conversations or to to listen to people being vulnerable like that.
She rang me at the time and was really struggling with it. Of how do I communicate this to, they were pretty new at that point. I think they'd been open for maybe 2 years, maybe a little longer. And when you've become part of that community and the community has come to rely on you, so to speak, for their loaf of rye bread or their loaf of sourdough or their cup of coffee, changing that is a risk. It is giving somebody an excuse to say, well, on a Wednesday when you're not open, I'll go get my coffee down the street. And maybe you don't come back. And I remember she called me and she said, what do you think I should do? And I actually, this was a very Noma thing. This was a very Renee thing. I just said, be honest. Be honest. Explain it. Tell them why. And the people who don't support you, they were never really supporters. The ones that are truly supporters or fans of what you do, this will just graft them on even more so. And it did. It's been nothing but successful for them. And so I do think, to your point, people are more willing to listen and understand. I think, and again, Dani, don't get me wrong, I was outside of Australia at the time. So I appreciate your feedback that, maybe there were rolled eyes or comments under the breath about, hospitality, it's hard, we get it, kind of move on. But actually my sense was there was a realization of how hard it really was, and that the community was more willing to stand with it and support it. Now, of course, in a time of cost of living pressures, there's only so much support the community can give when they themselves are thinking about how do they keep the lights on at home, or how do they manage their grocery bill, or whatever it might be. But at least my sense, at least where I was in the world at the time, was a realization of how hard hospitality really was, and that people were willing to do what they could to support it because they had seen some of their favorite cafes and their favorite restaurants close, and they didn't want it to happen.
Yeah, look, I think, all things were happening at once. People were genuinely going out of their way to support businesses that they loved or that they felt were in need, certainly, as much as they could. But I think, there was a lot of sentiment swirling around of all different types. I mean, Ben, you were an insider at Noma for all that time, and I know you're still working with Renee on some other projects. Like, what were some of the lessons or approaches that people would be interested to hear about from that period?
Well, I mean, I will say Scandi socialism is a thing. The government wrapped its arms around the industry, like truly wrapped its arms around the industry. And look, I appreciate, and I'm not as close to it in terms of what was done at a state and federal government level here, but there, I mean, I remember my Danish wasn't very good, but I remember the Prime Minister saying something along the lines of, it will be better to put the economy, which included retail, hospitality, the experience economy, we'll put it in the deep freeze because it'll be better and easier to defrost it than it will be to watch it break and to rebuild it. And we were very fortunate. We were very fortunate to have a government wrap its arms around the industry. We at Noma were very fortunate that we had partners, the few brands that we worked with who were invested in seeing Noma come out on the other side. But at the same time, through periods of adversity come innovation, come new ideas that force, that you're forced to explore. And out of that, don't get me wrong, there was adversity. One of the restaurants within the group didn't make it to the other side. But out of the pandemic came Noma Projects, which is a product company that Renee and the team started a couple of years ago. Out of the pandemic came Popple, which was the burger concept, which originally was a 6-week concept to keep the staff busy, try to kind of give back to the community at a time when borders were closed, there were no tourists, but we were, kind of allowed to operate again. This was in the first European summer of the pandemic. That kind of 6-week experience was so good, both from a business but also from a kind of connectivity perspective, that a new business was established out of that. Once things had settled on the other side of, what was it then, 21. So, and again, if you had said to me 5 years ago, 6 years ago, would Noma have established a product company, or, kind of been a part of creating some of these other side projects with some extraordinary creators, I don't know if I would have been as definitive as to whether it would have, but it came from that period. It came from that, again, even with government supporting us the way that it did and having partners support us the way that they did, it was touch and go at times. For a business that has as many people within the tent, so to speak, there was an enormous burden that we had to keep going, to keep the lights on, etc. And that diversification is now really part of, and I know that's not the topic of today, but very much part of Renee's vision for the future of Noma, and this idea of what it will become in 2025. A lot of that comes from those months, those years within the pandemic, and realizing that a fine dining restaurant that serves 80, 90 people 5 days a week, it's now 4 days a week, but 5 days a week, 45 weeks of the year, isn't sustainable anymore, either as a business, but more importantly, at a team level, culture level, creativity level. Everything was on the table. And I think that's where you and I started when we spoke last week, is, again, there's no one answer. Everything has to be on the table. And so it should be. I just think the industry needs encouragement to continue considering those things, and maybe people around them, whether that be industry, government, private, who are, supporting the industry to explore areas and things that perhaps historically they haven't done before.
I reckon I'd love to talk to you about identity, because I think that would be so crucial to, all the different industries that you've worked across. And, as you're speaking about Noma and the different avenues that it went down as a business, the question to me is, how do you know if it's right for Noma? Like, is it on brand? Are you diluting yourself? Are you losing yourself? Will your customers want to engage because they know what it is they're supporting? Do they feel part of it? I'd say, that would be similar to music and TV and those other arenas, wouldn't it?
Absolutely it would. I started my career in the music industry back when they sold CDs, so a long time ago. But, it faced an existential crisis around 2001, when a file sharing platform called Napster came in and just disrupted anything. Why pay $30 for an album when you can now get the individual tracks that you want for free? And put aside the legalities of that, because, I'm a staunch defender of copyright and IP, the rights of the creative class and community, including musicians, songwriters, TV showrunners, chefs. I think they are equal in terms of their impact and their creativity. But what that crisis did was it reminded the industry, which kind of had lost its way, that it was not in the business of selling $30 of plastic. It was in the business, $30 of plastic that, clearly reflected both the physical cost of producing that, but obviously the time and the effort of the individual. But they weren't in the business of selling plastic. They were in the business of selling music. And the moment they realized that, the industry started building, and it continued to build to a point that it is now bigger. than it was before Napster. And that's because when you realize in their case that they're in the business of music rather than plastic, that music can be a download, it can be a stream, it can be a live performance, it can be music in a television show, it can be music on radio, it can be merchandise, it can be vinyl, and even cassettes, which are apparently coming back these days in the ultimate full circle moment. And I think that's my point with hospitality is, and as I said, don't get me wrong, I know this is difficult, and I know it's increasingly difficult when you're just focused on keeping the lights on 7 days a week. But I think, to succeed, we need to start thinking of ourselves as more than just a physical manifestation of our creativity, and that the creativity that hospitality has and the service that it provides can be brought to life in far more places than just a cafe, a restaurant, or a wine bar. That said, it shouldn't just be all on the industry to fix this. It has to be a meaningful part of creating a future for itself. But I'm a believer that, and I said it earlier in the conversation, there are other stakeholders who have to be at the table here. And that includes government, and that includes industry, and that includes corporates. I think, we all have to come together to have a meaningful conversation about not only, for me, it's not about fixing it, because as I said, I don't think it's broken in such a black and white sense. It shouldn't be about just fixing it. It should be about elevating it. Because, by elevating it, we make it stronger and we make it more meaningful and impactful in every sense: economic, community, change, all of that.
Yeah, I think there's so much waiting, so much potential, and so much to be proud of that it does seem crazy that as a society we wouldn't come together to lift this all up. Because we're all engaged with hospitality as workers, as owners, as diners, and it's such a part of our identity. We're so proud of it, but it's so hard for people to create it, to deliver it.
Food, hospitality, dining, all of the above is the lens with which we see ourselves. It is the lens that we can explore our history, our culture, our community, our economy, all of that. That's why again, I'll get back on the soapbox and say our chefs, our front of house staff are certainly as hardworking, but as creative, as impactful as any creative community that I've been fortunate to be a part of throughout my career. It's why, for me, success is elevating the industry, but elevating those individuals into the same class that we hold our sports people, our musicians, our authors, our designers. And yes, there are some. Of course, there are some. But I think the industry is ready to be celebrated at more of a grassroots level as well.
I love that, Ben. We could talk all day, but I reckon let's leave it there. I think you've given people a lot to think about. You've given me a lot to think about. I think the reason that I never get sick of writing about food is that, it cuts across so many of the things you've spoken about, creativity, environment, politics, history, everything. So it's when you think of it like that, it makes sense that all these different ways of thinking about the world should come together to foster and support it.
Thanks for having me. I also just wanted to say, Dani, look, you also need to be recognised and acknowledged and celebrated for what you're you're doing.
Oh,
you know,
shush.
No, I'm not saying that just because you had me on. You are one of the leading voices in trying to force this conversation, because it is a conversation that has to be had, and you know, you should be thanked for that. So I do, and of course, thank you for having me on as well.
Oh, well, thank you for making the time. I really appreciate it, Ben. Thanks for your insights, and yeah, we'll keep the conversation going.
We'll keep talking. Thanks, Dani.
This is Dirty Linen, and I'm Dani Valent. We air the issues that the hospitality industry finds hard to talk about, hearing from different people with unique perspectives. We want to hear from you as well. If you have something that needs to be said about a topic, get in touch so we can include your perspective. Contact us at dirtylinen@deepintheweeds.com.au or hit us up on Insta at Dirty Linen Podcast. We can't wait to hear from you.
This